So let's talk a little bit about the orientation of 3D space, and this will give us a little bit more reference when we start building some of the details of our snowman. So I mentioned in the previous presentation that it's not arbitrary that Y is the up axis, Z is the forward background axis, and X is the left-right axis. So by default, we're kind of looking at Cinema 4D in this perspective view. And generally what we want to do is we want to think of looking at the front of the object as looking down the Z-axis, or looking in the direction that the default object's Z direction is pointing, so the blue arrow. And what I mean by that is that if I want to think about the front of this object, I'm just going to hold down the Option key and click and drag to orbit around. So right now, my viewport is generally looking down in the direction of Z, okay? Which means that this will be the front of my object. The X direction is left and right. So if we were in Illustrator or Photoshop and we were moving things around according to, a coordinate system, or just moving things around, and we look at some of the information that the application is presenting us, as we move things up, we move it along the Y-axis, and as we move things left and right, we're moving it along the X. Okay, so either in a positive or negative direction. Okay, same is true for Cinema 4D. Z becomes the foreground background direction. That becomes really important, not just for reference inside Cinema 4D, but as we go out to other programs for rendering. Maybe we're making some assets for a game that we're making. To get that asset out, if we build everything the front of the object relative to the X-axis, then things are going to be all turned around and cause more problems than they're worth. So it's really important early on that we start to understand that the blue axis, the Z-axis, is considered the foreground background, or forward and backwards direction. Now, what I want to do is I want to build just a real quick reference so that I don't get disoriented. I want to build a couple of eyes on this object, and just so that I kind of have a sense as I'm moving around, it'll be kind of a point of reference. And so I'm going to get started, and I'm going to create the eyes based on a sphere, just like I did the body. They're obviously going to be much smaller, but before I start to change the size of these things, what I'll do is I'll quickly name it, and I'm just going to name it eye. I'm going to move that object up along Y, and in this case, I'm going to make this object very small, and it's going to get lost inside the thing that I'm modeling. So what I like to do is I'm going to move it up just a little bit over the object, so that as I reduce the size, and I'll come over to the radius of the object in the Attributes Manager, and I'm going to reduce the size. Now, we looked in the previous presentation that we could reduce the size of objects or modify its parameters. In this case, it's the radius parameter, a couple of different ways. I can key in a value here if I know what that value is. I can also use these up-down arrows to kind of, change that value. I could also click and drag on those arrows, and as I push up, it gets bigger, and as I push down, it gets smaller. I could also grab this little control point, this little orange point on the object, and in this case, this sphere, I could just click and drag. Now, I almost always change the size of parametrics according to the Attributes Manager. And what I can also do is just click and activate the parameter in radius, and if I have a mouse wheel, I can also use my mouse wheel. So there's a couple of different ways to do that, and I'll get it down to the general size that I want, and then I'll round this value off. So I'm going to make it a little big for now. I think it's a little big, about 8 centimeters, and that's just relative to the rest of this object. And so I'll move it back down, and I've only moved this object according to the Y-axis. And I can tell because I look at the position coordinates. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this object down into the snowman head, and then I'll grab it by the Z-axis and I'll pull it in the opposite direction of the arrow. And what that's doing is kind of pushing it through to the front of the snowman. Okay? Now, this snowman currently has one eye, and it's perfectly centered according to X on the left or right side of the snowman's face, which would be cool if I wanted a cycloptic snowman, if I was making a cyclops snowman, which I could do. But if you're going to make a Cyclops snowman, make a standard snowman with 2 eyes and then add the Cyclops later in the scene. That's because kind of managing this content is going to be really important. What I want to do is I want to zoom in on this object. Now, there's a couple of different ways to zoom in. I could zoom in with my mouse wheel, and as I get fairly close, I could then use the number 1 key and click and drag and pan over. Okay, or I could use these tools up here as we discovered. What I'm going to do is tap the S key. S is in Sam. And what the S key does is whatever object you have selected, it will frame that selected object. So think of S as selected. So if I selected the bottom object and I tap the S key, I frame that object in the center of my view. If I select the eye, I'll tap the S key and that frames that eye in the center of my selection. So I'll just move, dolly out a little bit here. So as I mentioned, that eyeball is directly in the center of my snowman. So I kind of want it offset a little bit. Now, when we're looking in a 3D space, generally I spend most of my time in this perspective viewport. So I can kind of look at it from the side. I can orbit around and look at it generally from the front. This isn't a perfectly front-on view, but it's more or less looking down the Z-axis, okay? I'll just reframe that a little bit, and as you see, as we pan around, we're getting the benefit of perspective. That's why when I move this off to the right, I can see that that Z is pointing back in this direction. That's why we're seeing these vanishing points in our world grid back here, and as I pan over to the right, I can see that, you know, the perspective of the blue Z-axis changes a little bit, and that's because I'm looking through a perspective viewport. But I'm generally looking at from the front of the object. Okay, now if I wanted a super precise view of all different sides, what I could do is I could roll my mouse up here and go into the split view. And by splitting the view, if I click on this icon that's furthest to the right, just before we end up off in the object manager, if I click on that button, it'll send us out to this split screen view, and in the top left-hand corner of each one of these views, it's showing us what our viewport is. So in the case of the right view, we're looking at it from the side. In the case of the top view, we're looking at this object from the top, and in the front view, we're looking at it from the front. So in the perspective viewport, we're looking at this object shaded, and I'm just rolling my mouse inside this view. You can see that as I roll my mouse around, depending on which window I give focus, and I give focus by rolling my mouse over it, I'm not clicking or anything, but if I roll my mouse over the front view and then I use my mouse wheel, that window begins to have focus. Same thing with the top view. I'll roll my mouse. So I can just kind of navigate around and choose which view is my active view. Now, the reason I went into this viewport is because I want to pay special attention to the front view here, and I'll just roll in with my mouse wheel, but you can see I'm starting to kind of lose the perspective. So I'm going to tap the S key just like I did before, and I'm looking at the eyeball zoomed way in, and I'll just use the mouse to kind of zoom back out. Now, when it comes to looking at the front viewport, there's a lot of important information here. One, and I'll just kind of reframe this view. You can see the clear overlap in this wireframe view of the front of my model. So I have my top, middle, and bottom, and because I'm in the front view, one, I don't have any perspective, but I can also see what the overlap is between the two objects, and that can be a valuable thing. Okay, but what I'm most interested in is arranging the eyes in a way that makes sense. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in. I'm going to recompose my view a little bit. Now this is going to be either the left eye or the right eye. Okay, and so remember, this is the front of my snowman face, and if I just slide this over a little bit, and I'll just push it over about 14 or 15 centimeters, I want you to pay special attention to the fact that along the X, this has a position along the X, it's 15 centimeters in my case away from 0. Now let me undo that. I'll Command Z. I've only moved this eye according to two directions. I've moved it according to Y when we lifted it up, and then we moved it according to Z when we pushed it out through the front of the face. Now I want to move this according to X, and I can be kind of just fluid about this. I'll just push it over, and I don't really care that I moved it 20.8, but whatever I move it over here, I should notice the X position. And because I pushed it to the left, it went to the negative position. Now that's telling us some really important information. The center of this object, because of the way that we built it, the center, according to X, is at 0. So if I were to zero out the X coordinate of this object, this thing is perfectly aligned with the head or the top object. So when I push that over to the left, I can generate a new sphere and move this essentially into the exact same coordinate system, but place it over on the right side of the head by copying down these coordinates here and just changing the negative 19 and some change according to the X, just converting that to a positive number. And I can test this by simply getting rid of the negative value and hitting return, and I can see that that slides over to the right. Because it's using 0 as the center point, if I go -5 with one object and +5 with the other, they're going to be perfectly aligned. Now, if I push it over to the right, I can just create a negative value and slide that over. Okay, so this is relative through the forward viewport or the front viewport. We're looking, this red axis becomes the left-right axis. Okay, so rather than generating a new object and having to copy all of these coordinates now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select the eye. I'm going to Command C to copy and Command V to paste, and when I do that, you'll see that I get a copy in the Object Manager. I could also go to Edit, Copy, and Edit, Paste, but I like the quick keys of Command C, Command V. That gives me an exact duplicate of my eye object, but it gives me the advantage that it copies and pastes it in the exact same coordinates of the object that I copied it from. So all I have to do is get rid of the negative value on the X, and when I hit return, you can see now that these two eyes are perfectly centered along this object. Okay, so now I want to jump back into my perspective view, and I can do that. You'll notice that when we look in the top right-hand corner of all of these windows, they all have those same sets of icons that allow us to pan, dolly, and orbit. We don't want to orbit in a 2D view, even though we can. I'm going to discourage you from doing that. If we click on this little icon in the top right-hand corner, whatever viewport we're looking in, that's the viewport that's going to maximize. So I want to go back to my perspective viewport, click on the top right-hand corner. I think my eyes are set too far apart. So from a design standpoint, I'll tinker with this a little bit. Now I could, move this eyeball in a little bit and then select the other eyeball and move that in, and then just, figure out what the happy place is for my left eye, and I'll just round that down to -15, and I'll just go over to my other eye, which demands that this needs to be +15 if I still want them centered, which I do. Or, I could just get rid of one of the eyes, grab this eye and kind of move it around and say, okay, well, whatever that is, I'm going to copy and paste, and I'll select the new eye and just get rid of the negative. And that should be pretty good. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. I got things centered. So what I really want to do now is one more time do a quick audit of the bottom of my object, and I just see that everything's at 0. Okay. My bottom's at the origin of my 3D space. When I go to middle, I see that the X and the Z are 0. That means that they're aligned according to the top-down view. So Z and X are at 0. Let's see if I can kind of flatten this out a little bit more. Kind of disoriented in space here. Let me just recompose that. There we go. So I'm more or less looking down. I got a nice kind of flat top-down view here. They're centered along Z and X. So I'll just kind of change my view here. I'll zoom out a little bit. I'll go to my top object, and I see that that's X and Z is still set to 0. So it's really just changing the Y value of those spheres. When it comes to the eyes, of course, we're going to move it up. We're also going to move it out in the Z space and then left and right according to the X. That becomes tricky if you're trying to move it according to all three axes at the same time. I like, again, move it up along the Y, push it out according to the Z. That'll give you kind of a frame of reference. And as you get more experience playing around in 3D, it'll be easier and easier to be more precise with that. So that's just a little bit about kind of the relative perspective and the different viewports in Cinema 4D. In the next presentation, we'll talk about creating basic materials. So we'll do that in the next video.